climate scientist on board with us today. And Katharine is a great friend of EEN, and she is on our board of directors and is our chief scientific advisor. So we're so glad that she is with us today on this show. And so we're going to begin with a word of prayer and turn it right over to Katharine so we can get going with this. So let's give a word of prayer. And again, I'm Reverend Mitch Hescox. And if you do have any questions, please submit them by the chat room and we will talk about them at the end. And Katharine, thank you for doing this for us. We really appreciate it. You are really an awesome person. So, we're just so proud that you're part of our community. So with that, let's pray. Holy and gracious God, we just thank you for this time to be together. Lord, you are the God of all creation. And Lord, we've done a pretty poor job of being tenants of what you've called us to steward. So Lord, open us up, give us wisdom to how to act, to care for your creation, to care for your children who are being so impacted by climate change. And Lord, please bless Katharine and all of her work as a scientist and her ministry, and now guide us on this time together. We pray this in the God who is about to come again, in Jesus Christ. And it's his name we pray. Amen. So Katharine, thank you so much for being with us, and I will turn it over to you and go on mute.
Thank you so much, Mitch. So thank you everybody for waiting a little bit. I was here, but I just couldn't get in. Unfortunately, there was some issue with access, but I'm here now, and hopefully you are able to see me as well as see the screen. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay, perfect. All right, so let's just go into here. So as you know, I am a lead author on the U.S. National Climate Assessment on both the first volume that came out last year and the second volume that came out just a few weeks ago. Although now it seems like it was like a couple of months already, because we measure our life, so the brain scientists tell us in terms of the number of experiences we have. And I think between when this report came out and today, it's been about 2 years worth of experiences for me. So as this cartoon puts it, now just checking, you can see the second slide, right? Yes, Mitch nods. As this cartoon puts it, we live in very interesting times. And unfortunately, a lot of those things are not only interesting, but pretty depressing when we see the headlines. There's headlines of disasters almost weekly, it seems like. The destructive impacts of Hurricane Harvey, which still remain today in Texas over a year later. The California wildfires, they set a new record for the greatest area burned last year, earlier this year, and then again just recently with the Camp Fires. The headlines around the world talk about coral bleaching, records being set, heat waves affecting people all around. And so after last year's hurricane season in 2017, when the Prime Minister of Dominica spoke to the United Nations, this is what he said. He said, to deny climate change is to deny a truth that we have just lived. If you go to the Yale program on climate change communication, if you're not aware of them, they're a great resource with a lot of public opinion polling. You can click on each congressional district in each state and each county, and you can actually see the results to about, I think they're up to about 20 different questions now. When you go there and you look at the question, is global warming caused mostly by human activities? We can see that large swaths of the country are still below 50%. So anything that's blue is less than 50%. The average of the country is actually a little bit over 50%, but you can see that large parts of the country are still below. So when we see this often, oops, there we go. We think, well, if they just knew the facts, surely they'd change their minds, right? And this is a little cartoon from one of our global weirding episodes. It's probably the global weirding episode that I recommend the most to people wanting to talk about climate change, because it talks about how if we just tell people the facts, that isn't necessarily what's going to change their minds. But we scientists operate very much on a fact basis. So what we do when we're worried about people not having the right opinion about something is we write a report. So last year in November, the first volume of the National Climate Assessment came out. So I know it's confusing having all these different reports, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through each one of these reports so that you know the difference between them and you know what information you can find in one versus the other. So the report that came out last year was volume 1, and it focuses exclusively on the science. You can find it online at science2017.globalchange.gov, and it talks about what's happening around the world, to global temperature, to sea ice in the Arctic, to sea level rise in the giant ice sheets of Antarctica and Greenland, what's happening to temperature and precipitation right here in the United States. And it also talks, interestingly, the last chapter, about what it is that we know that we don't know. That's something kind of unusual for scientists. We usually prefer to talk about what we know that we do know. But there's a lot of surprises that the climate system has in store for us. Most of them we suspect will be unpleasant. And so chapter 15 gets into what are some of those things that we know we don't know, but that we're very concerned about as a result. So volume 1 is still, a year later, the most comprehensive and up-to-date assessment of climate science today. And it will be until the 6th IPCC report comes out, and that's not going to come out for several more years. So if you're looking for an authoritative source for climate science, if you're looking for the latest on global trends, how do we know it's human, what's happening to temperature and rainfall right here in the United States, how is that affecting sea level rise and sea ice in the Arctic, this is where you want to go. It was written by 50 authors. It's almost 500 pages when you look at the document, but of course it's on the website, so it's easy to just kind of click from chapter to chapter. And it was reviewed by 12 federal agencies, all the federal agencies that had a relevant expertise to this topic. Even though it's so long, it can be summarized in just one sentence. And I would summarize it like this. Volume 1 tells us that climate change is real, it is us, it's serious, and the window of time to prevent widespread dangerous impacts is closing fast. We don't put a number on that. I know the IPCC report puts on the 1.5 degrees, puts a number, 12 years, on our chances to meet 1.5 degrees. But that number is based on a lot of assumptions regarding how much carbon we produce each year. And it also, unfortunately, I feel, communicates kind of, if we make it by 12 years, we're okay, but if we reach January 1st on the year 13, we're all going to hell in a handbasket. And that's not the case. What is the case is for every gigaton that we produce, there's an additional amount of damages that are going to occur. And so the best time to stop is as soon as possible with as low as we can. So the section that I particularly worked on was the one that looks at the choices that we can make. When we look at the future in terms of our carbon emissions on the left and our temperature on the right, the difference between these different colored lines depends on us. How much carbon are we going to produce based on the technology, the agricultural practices, the design of our cities, increases in efficiency, development of new clean energy sources? That's what makes up the difference between these different lines. So this is not, hopefully, a depressing figure showing what's going to happen no matter what. Rather, this should be taken as a motivational figure showing us what is possible if we act. In terms of what is depressing, though, probably the #1 question I get, and I feel like I've gotten it almost every day. I've already got this question once today, and I got it yesterday too, for sure. The question I get just about every day is, what gives you hope? And to answer that question, I have to say, first of all, it is not the science. Because when we look at the science, this is what it tells us, and this is what the last chapter gets into. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere have passed 400 parts per million. We haven't seen this level last year, we thought, for 3 million years, but since then a new analysis of paleoclimate data came out saying we haven't actually seen it for about 15 million years. So in other words, it hasn't occurred in the history of human civilization. And last time we saw 400 parts per million, temperature and sea level rise were significantly higher than today. If carbon dioxide emissions continue to grow, it would lead to atmospheric levels we haven't seen for tens of millions of years. And this is the crazy thing. As far back as we can go in the historical record, we don't see any time when this much carbon has been going into the atmosphere this fast. In fact, the time of greatest change that we can see in the entire paleoclimate record, we estimate about 10% of today's emissions were going into the atmosphere per year. So we are conducting an unprecedented experiment with our planet at a scale that, as far as we can tell, has never yet been done. Now, let me just step aside here a second, take off my scientist hat and put on my communication hat and say, a lot of the people who we talk to and we interact with would, as soon as you put this up on the screen, they would just check out. Why? Because a lot of people in the United States believe that the Earth is very young. And so people say, okay, well, let's get them on board with the science showing that the Earth is old first, and then we can talk about climate change. And my answer to that is no, for two reasons. One, we don't have time. And the second, more practical and pragmatic reason is it doesn't matter. Because to agree that climate is changing due to human activities and the conditions today are unusual, we only have to agree the world is at least 300 years old, because that's when everything started to change due to human activities, the Industrial Revolution. And just about everybody, I've never met anybody who didn't agree the world is 300 years old. I won't say there isn't such a person, because there are people who think the Earth is flat as well. But most people agree that the world is 300 years old. And so if you're talking to a group of people where you think there's going to be people there who think the world is young, it just makes sense to say, you know what? CO2 levels have passed 400 parts per million, a level that has never been seen in the history of human civilization on this planet. Continued growth would lead to concentrations that we have never seen. And the present day emissions rate of nearly 10 gigatons of carbon per year far exceeds anything that we have seen in the history of civilization in this planet. So there's no need in my mind to step on the mine and turn people off immediately, because we don't have to agree on the age of the Earth to agree that climate is changing, humans are responsible, and the experiment that we're conducting with our planet is really unprecedented. So then the New York Times wrote about our report, and they called me and they said, well, do you think this report is going to change the administration's mind? And I said to them, no, I don't. If someone's not already on board with the science, or they're disengaged and they feel like it doesn't matter, throwing a huge amount of more scientific information at them is not what's going to change their mind. In fact, research that Dan Kahan did 5 years ago already made this point. He found that people with the highest degree of scientific literacy were not most concerned about climate change. Rather, they were most polarized on the issue, because the smarter we are and the more we know about science, the better we are at cherry picking the arguments that support our pre-existing opinions. Isn't that interesting? And Larry Hamilton is another social scientist at the University of New Hampshire. He did what I find to be a very depressing study, where he actually looked at the effect of education on people's answers to the question, do you think climate is changing now, caused mainly by human activities? He found that depending on the political party that people affiliated themselves with, more education either helped or had no effect, that's the red line, or in some cases was actually detrimental. And here you can see the arrows showing the difference between high school versus people who have postgraduate education. Why is that? It's because people don't really genuinely have a problem with the science that explains why climate is changing, because the same science, the exact same physics, explains how our stoves work, how our fridges work, and how airplanes fly. So if people really had a problem with basic thermodynamics and nonlinear fluid dynamics, they wouldn't have stoves, they wouldn't have fridges, they definitely wouldn't fly, and there would be a lot of government legislation and votes in the Senate saying, we vote against the reality of stoves. But there isn't, because people don't really have a problem with the science. In fact, the sciencey sounding objections that I hear every single day are smoke screens. They're smoke screens for the real problem, and the real problem is this. Since this isn't a mystery novel, I'm going to go ahead and tell you the conclusion. The real problem is that we believe that the risk that solutions pose to our life is much higher than the risk that the impacts pose to our lives. 70% of people in the US agree that climate is changing, that it will affect people in developing countries, future generations, and plants and animals. But the majority of people in the US do not believe that climate change will affect them personally. Even if they 100% agree with the science, they don't think it will affect them personally. Instead, when people talk about the solutions, we're told that there will be taxes, that people can't drive their cars anymore, that we can't use the light bulbs that we're used to, that it will destroy the economy, that it will let China get ahead, none of which is true. But we're told that the solutions, we're deliberately told that the solutions pose a very high risk to our comfort and our way of life. And we are also believe that the impacts pose a very minimal risk. But to say it's a real problem for developing countries, future generations, and plants and animals, but I don't want to fix it, that makes us the bad guy. And we don't want to be the bad guy. We want to be the good person. We want to be the hero. So rather than saying it's real, but I don't want to fix it because I think the solutions pose a greater threat to my way of life than the impacts, instead of that, we throw out sciencey sounding smokescreens, like it's just a natural cycle, or the scientists are just making it up for the money. Because in that case, we're not the bad person. We're going to get into how to tackle that later. But first of all, I want to show you this. This is the figure we saw before about people who think global warming is mostly caused by human activities. This is the figure we think is usually the problem. But I'm going to show you a different figure, and this figure asks people, do you think climate change affects you? And so this is the actual data I talked about. Look at this. Even people who are totally convinced that climate is changing due to human activities, they don't think it affects them. And then you might say, okay, but I see a couple of counties here, right? A couple of orange counties. Who lives in those orange counties? Those orange counties are made up of the most concerned people group about a changing climate, and that concerned people group is Hispanic Catholics. Now you might say, of course it's Hispanic Catholics, the Pope, right? Well, yeah, but except the least concerned people group in the entire United States is white Catholics. Yeah, they edge out us white evangelicals by 1 percentage point. It's good not to be the bottom on one thing, right? So the problem is, the greatest myth that the largest number of people have bought into is that climate change doesn't matter to me. Why? Because when we're presented with images of what the impacts of climate change look like, this is the #1 type of image. And I've spoken to my colleagues in Canada and in Norway, like I did just last week, and out of kind of morbid curiosity, I polled fellow scientists in 2 of the countries that are most famous for having the largest polar bear populations in the world. And I asked the scientists how many people had seen a real live polar bear with their own eyes in the wild. And out of about 100 people, maybe 4 or 5 hands went up. And these are scientists who live in countries with polar bears. So why would we expect people to care if the #1 image is of an animal that very few people have seen, or if it is an image of people, it's an image of people who live very far away from us in places that we've never been. It's because, again, people do agree that people in developing countries will be harmed. They just don't think it matters to us. So that's why I really do believe that the most dangerous myth the largest number of people have bought into isn't that the science is somehow a matter of opinion or optional or not real. It's the idea that climate change is a distant issue. It only affects future generations or places that are far away. And that myth is exactly what Volume 2 of the National Climate Assessment addresses. So Volume 1 was about the science, Volume 2 brings it home. You can find Volume 2 online at nca2018.globalchange.gov. And it doesn't have a chapter for every different part of the climate system. It has a chapter for every region of the United States and every sector. So it's very human focused. There's a chapter on water, transportation, infrastructure, the economy, health, ecosystems, the Northeast, the Midwest, the Southeast, the islands, Alaska. This is not meant to be read in one sitting because it is over 1,600 pages long. It is not meant to be read in a sitting. It is meant to be, you pick out the chapter that you're interested in that relates to your sector or your region. Because it was so much bigger, it was written by over 350 of us, but I also co-authored this one too. And this is the most comprehensive and up-to-date assessment, not of the science, but of how climate change is affecting us here in the United States, and this is really important, how we're responding. If I had to summarize Volume 2 in one sentence, well, it's a bit of a cheat. It's sort of 2 sentences here. I mean, you know, it's 3 times longer, so I think I should get a couple extra lines. If I had to summarize this in 2 sentences, I would say, or 3, I would say, Volume 2 tells us that climate change is no longer a distant issue. It is affecting every single one of us in every part of the US across almost every sector. And this is important, the more climate changes, the more serious and even dangerous the impacts will be. One of the most important ways that climate change affects us is through supercharging our naturally occurring weather and climate disasters. So NOAA, not Noah's Ark, but the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA keeps a list of the number of weather and climate disasters that have happened per state since 1980 that have caused at least $1 billion worth of damage. So this is important because it's human-centric. So imagine if Hurricane Harvey had never made landfall, but it was just as big and just as powerful. Would it be on this map? No, it wouldn't. What's on this map are events that actually affect us. And you will see that my state, where I live, Texas, is number 1. It's had $102 billion climate and weather disasters since 1980, many of them causing much more than $1 billion. The drought we had in 2011 and 2012 cost over $10 billion. Hurricane Harvey cost over $120 billion. So we're talking some serious amount of money here. How does this connect to climate change? It's because climate change is loading the dice against us. It's taking these naturally occurring events like hurricanes, wildfire, flood, heat waves, and it's making them stronger in the case of hurricanes with more rainfall associated with them. It's making heat waves more frequent. It's making droughts more intense. It's loading the dice against us. So imagine we always have a chance of rolling that double six. But all of a sudden, we're starting to see double sixes show up more frequently than they used to. And then we see a double seven. A double seven is the worst, greatest area ever burned by wildfire in California. And we throw a double seven 3 times in 12 months. That's how climate change is affecting us. So let me give you a couple of examples from the second volume. First of all, we know that on any given year, we break cold temperature records and hot temperature records. In fact, last year, we broke 10,000 cold temperature records in the United States alone. So you might be saying, well, hang on a second, Catherine. I thought you're talking about how extremes are increasing. Yes, because the same year, we broke over 35,000 high temperature records. So what this figure shows is it shows the ratio between cold and high temperature records. The ratio should be 1 to 1 if climate isn't changing. But the more climate is changing, the more high temperature records we're breaking. So the ratio increases to 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1, and beyond. We're also seeing that heavy precipitation is increasing as well. Heavy precipitation events have increased most in the Northeast and the Midwest, and we're not calling them precipitation just to be all sciencey. We're calling them precipitation because precipitation can fall as rain, but precipitation can also fall as snow. So here's the crazy thing. As the world warms, warmer air holds more water vapor, and evaporation rates also increase. So when a storm comes along, there's more water vapor for that storm to sweep up and dump on us today than there was 50 or 100 years ago. What happens if it's below freezing when that storm comes along? There's still more water vapor there for the storm to sweep up and dump, but you know how the water vapor falls? It falls as snow. So ironically, some of the record-breaking snowfalls that have occurred on the East Coast in the last 10 years were amplified or supersized by a changing climate. That's why climate change, or as our little videos call it, global weirding, I think is a better way to talk about this than global warming, because otherwise people have this profound disconnect between, well, how can we be breaking cold temperature records and having record-breaking snowstorms at the same time as the planet is warming? And the reality is it's all part and parcel of the same change in our weather statistics that's being driven by a 1 degree warming in the temperature of the planet. 1 degree C, I should add, 2 degrees Fahrenheit is what's already happened. The depressing news is also that our climate models tend to underestimate the observed trends in extreme precipitation. People often say to me, oh, those climate models are so biased. And my answer is yes, they actually are biased when it comes to long-term change and change in extremes. They systematically underestimate what we've already seen happening. Although in terms of looking at temperature and looking at decadal scale change, 10, 20, 50 years, they're actually right on the money there. What else do we see? Well, if you live on the West Coast, now I'm not a West Coast person. I grew up on the East Coast, or center of the country really, in Toronto. But if you're a West Coast person, if you're from California, Oregon, Washington State, British Columbia, you know about atmospheric rivers. Atmospheric rivers are a fascinating phenomena. They are literally a river in the sky of very high levels of atmospheric water vapor that are transported thousands of miles across the Pacific. They're also known colloquially as pineapple expresses because they bring the rain, all the water vapor right from Hawaii. And when they reach the coast and they hit the mountain range, the air mass starts to head up the mountain range. It cools, it can't hold as much water vapor anymore, and it dumps like a bomb, a rain bomb though. So we expect the frequency and the severity of these rivers to get worse. And you know that they're getting a river in California when you see a lot of news reports about landslides and flooding and heavy rain events. That's what these cause. Of course, if we're on the East Coast or the Gulf of Mexico, we don't get atmospheric rivers, we get hurricanes. And in other parts of the world, they get them too, but they call them cyclones or typhoons, but they're all the same thing. Hurricanes are tropical storms that get their energy from ocean water. We don't have hurricanes unless it's warm enough to support their formation. And the warmer the ocean gets, the stronger the hurricanes get. We aren't seeing more frequent hurricanes. 2017 was just an unusual season. Long term, we don't see a change in the number. But the ones that we get, no matter if we get a little bit or a lot, the ones we get are getting stronger, they're getting bigger, they're actually slowing down, and they have a lot more rainfall associated with them than they used to. In fact, during Hurricane Harvey, almost 40% of the rain that fell during that storm would not have fallen if the same hurricane had occurred 100 years ago. That's a lot of the damages. It's far more than 40% of the damages, because if you get 50 inches of rain, right, then the first 30 inches cause a certain amount of damage, but the last 20 inches cause even more damage. So I don't know the exact numbers, but it's a lot more than 40% of the damages of Hurricane Harvey were supersized by a changing climate. On the Atlantic coast, they're seeing sunny day or high tide flooding on a regular basis. It is increasing exponentially among many small towns along the coast. The National Climate Assessment has a lot of very specific examples of certain places. And this, for example, is a tidal gauge at Fort Pulaski near Savannah, Georgia, showing the number of days per year when they are already and will in the future experience high day flooding. So you can see in the 60s, they were, some years with 0, some years with maybe maximum 5 or 6 in the 60s. Then you get into the 80s and you're starting to consistently see 5 to 10 days of high tide flooding per year. Now you get to where we are today, they're seeing almost 40. So they went from some years with nothing to now they're getting consistently 30 to 40, almost a month worth of high tide flooding events per year. And especially under a higher scenario, this could end up being almost the entire year. So Fort Pulaski could be underwater due to sea level rise. That's pretty crazy. The United States also has climate refugees already. It is not a future concern, it is already happening. In Newtok, Alaska, in the coastal Louisiana, there are tribal nations who have lived in these places for generations and centuries, but they are now being forced to move due to sea level rise and coastal erosion. And this is an actual photo of the community, and this is a photo of the people of the community having a community meeting to try to figure out what to do. They are climate refugees, and they are right here in the United States today. In the Western states, and this chapter was actually written before the record-breaking wildfires. Only the Thomas Fire had happened when this was written. Before that, this report was written and again finalized well before the Camp wildfires. Yet it concludes in a very timely way that the area that's being burned, so it isn't the number of wildfires. Most wildfires in the US are actually human ignition. So it isn't the number of wildfires that's changing, it's the area burned. The area burned by wildfires has been increasing, and it shows here that almost half of that is due to a changing climate. So in other words, the area burned by wildfires would be much less if it wasn't for a changing climate. And what you're looking at here, of course, is you're looking at the cumulative area burned. So you're not looking at how more and more area is being burned every year naturally. You're looking at if you add up all the area burned by wildfires since I think this starts in like 1984. It's getting larger and larger, and almost half of that is due to climate change. Up in Alaska, of course, what used to be permanently frozen ground, permafrost, is thawing and crumbling, and that matters because there's homes on it, there's buildings on it, there's infrastructure on it, there's, ironically, oil pipelines on it. And so it's affecting disproportionately the people who live in those areas. And then the islands are being affected. Major airports, like the airport in Puerto Rico and San Juan, is just a foot or two above sea level. Many cultural monuments in Hawaii, including old sculptures, temples, graveyards, are within sunny day flooding by sea level, already now or within a couple of decades. Islands are also very sensitive to changes in rainfall, and rain is changing and it's getting drier in a lot of the Caribbean areas, and they're very concerned about that. And of course, with sea level rise, they're literally losing the land that they live on, not to mention its impact on tourism. And then you fold in ocean acidification and ocean warming and the impact on coral reefs and how that affects fisheries. Islands are some of the most vulnerable places to a changing climate because they have nowhere to go. Even down here in Texas, we care about a changing climate. We care because hurricanes are getting stronger, droughts are getting amplified, high temperature extremes are becoming more extreme. No matter where we live, we're being affected by a changing climate, and the number one way it's doing it is by interacting with our climate and weather extremes. So volume 2 really busts the myth that climate change doesn't matter to us. It does. And it does this primarily by taking these risks that are a normal, natural part of life on this planet and making them stronger or more frequent or more intense, or sometimes all three. And then, I said there wasn't a lot of hope in the science. And then there's simply the fact that when you look at what it's going to take to meet our goal, if you wanted to have a 66% chance of preventing a 2°C warming, which is the target of the Paris Agreement, then even if our emissions follow a lower pathway, and I would just remind everybody that our emissions hit a record high this past year, even if they somehow by a miracle follow a lower pathway the next 20 years, it just gives us about 20 years before we hit this budget. Now, again, that doesn't mean that it's all over. It just means that, for every additional gigaton we produce, there's greater impacts. Of course, the observed increase is actually more consistent with the higher scenario, which would give us even less time. So on the same day that the so-called Black Friday report was released, the second National Climate Assessment, I also just wanted to make you aware that there was a third report released that a lot of people don't talk about. This is called the State of the Carbon Cycle Report. And of course, it's very relevant because why are we changing climate? How are we changing climate? By disrupting the natural balance of the carbon cycle. By digging up and burning coal and gas and oil, releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that would otherwise remain in the ground for millions of years. So this report you can find online at carbon2018.globalchange.gov, and it's got a very handy summary so you don't have to read the whole thing. But what I want to do is I want to pull out one key piece of information from this report. And this is it. This report actually looks at the cost, how much it would cost the United States alone to reduce its emissions to a level that are consistent with the Paris target of 2 degrees, not 1.5, but 2 degrees. And it estimates, the second State of the Carbon Cycle report estimates, it would cost between $1 to $4 trillion, not including co-benefits. Now, this is really important because we know that there are significant co-benefits to reducing fossil fuels. In fact, from the perspective of health costs alone, we shouldn't have been using coal for 20 years. Why are we still using coal? Because the people bearing the costs are not the people making the profits. But if you look across the whole economy and you look at the benefits of reducing and eventually eliminating fossil fuel use, and imagine taking away the impacts of mountaintop removal coal mining, mercury poisoning, the 200,000 people in the United States who die every year from air pollution. I mean, you look at these co-benefits, and of course this number drops massively. In fact, some make the argument that it drops to 0, because the benefits are equal to the cost. But let's just take the worst case, the most conservative scenario, and say it's going to cost the US between $1 to $4 trillion to reduce their emissions without any co-benefits. US GDP is currently $20 trillion a year. So that would be between 5 to 20% of 1 year GDP. Or alternatively, it would be 1% of the GDP for 5 to 20 years. Okay, so this is one side. Let's look at the other side. The National Climate Assessment tells us that the cost of not reducing our emissions and continuing on our current pathway will cost us $200 billion a year by 2050. So what does this show us? It shows us that just looking at the economics and taking a very conservative perspective, within 5 to 20 years, depending on whether you go with $1 to $4 trillion, within 5 to 20 years, we would have a net benefit from reducing our carbon emissions in terms of the avoided impacts. Now, let me remind you again, this is a federal government report that specifically makes the economic case for meeting the targets of the Paris Agreement. If we are concerned about any time horizon longer than 5 to 20 years, and the only thing we care about is economics, we don't have to care about anything else, just economics, it makes sense to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement. So why is the United States not doing it? Well, you tell me, what is the election term? 4 years. It's less than the time horizon over which we'd see the payoff. By 2100, we expect the cost to be 1% of GDP, which is actually more than $200 billion per year because GDP is increasing every year. But here's the kicker for us. The kicker for us is it isn't just about us. We are not me first people. We are people who care about others, especially those who are poor and vulnerable and suffering today. And when you look at the impact that continuing on our current pathway will have on the poorest countries in the world, they're looking at losing 20%, 25% of their GDP. Massive costs that would absolutely trigger refugee crises. And you know what the relatively small refugee crisis, now I only say relatively small in terms of what we expect in the future. It was enormous, millions of people. But imagine the Syria refugee crisis times 100. Imagine the impact that would have on our world. That is not factored into the cost on the United States and the $200 billion, and is not factored into the co-benefits of reducing. So the bottom line is, by an objective economic analysis that simply considers the cost of meeting the target and the cost that climate change will exert on the US, over a maximum of 20 years or longer, the Paris Agreement makes economic sense. Isn't that crazy? Again, federal reports. So what type of response did we get? Well, Trump confuses climate change with weather. The White House says the climate report is based on the most extreme scenario, which I know it isn't because I wrote the scenarios chapter. We considered scenarios so low that we actually called them the fairy dust scenario. And of course, my favorite, climate scientists are just in it for the money. Now, you know, granted, we got paid $0 to write this report, but somehow we are still in it for the money because, you know, big green. I actually don't know, but that's what they say. So again, we might say, you know, if they just knew the facts, they'd change their minds, right? But in addition to the myth that it doesn't matter to me, the second most dangerous myth, and I want to get into this just a little bit before we end. So I know Kyle's been reminding people, but if you have questions, type them in the chat window because we are going to have time for questions at the end. So type your questions now. But let me just frame this for us before we get into the questions. The second most dangerous myth we've bought into is that I'm not the right type of person to care. And very specifically, we as Christians have bought into this myth in a big way. When it comes to climate change, we don't just throw up sciencey sounding myths, we throw up religiously sounding myths. God gave us dominion. God is in control. The world's going to end anyways. The Bible said there would always be seasons. Well, of course there's always going to be seasons. They'll just all be warmer. And my favorite, of course, is scientists are all just godless liberal atheists. We have people like our state senator in Texas saying climate change is not a science, it is a religion. And this is a very clever framing of the issue. Why is it so clever? Because those of us who already have a religion or a faith that is very important to us, we're not looking for a new one. So by casting climate change as a new religion, he's casting it as a false religion with false prophets, wolves in sheep's clothing, And any good Christian knows what to do with a false prophet, right? That's the framing that he's invoking here. When you look at concern by denomination, and this is the result that I alluded to earlier, that puts white Catholics at the bottom. Now, to be totally fair to white Catholics, if you look at the very concerned and somewhat concerned and you add those together, they actually do beat out white evangelicals. So you could make a case for saying that we are at the bottom, but I like the fact that on this plot, they put us one up from the bottom. If you are a white Catholic, I'm sorry for that. But what this shows is that there's a strong gradient in religious denominations in terms of people who feel like this is not something that I worry about. But the social science is really important. Again, there you have Hispanic Catholics at the top and white Catholics at the bottom. The social science is really important because people like John Evans look at this and they say that even though we know that conservative Protestants, and I would add AIM Catholics, are less likely to agree with climate science, what John found is that it isn't where we go to church. It isn't what we call ourselves religiously that actually creates this effect. Rather, he found that we don't really have a problem with the science, and we don't even have a problem with the theology, because we believe we're to be caretakers or stewards, and we believe we're to care for those less fortunate than us. What we do have a problem with is our political ideology. It is the correlation between political ideology and and religion that has then led to people rejecting the science of climate change. This is the problem. And as Galen Carey, who many of you may know, put it, I just love this quote because it really summarizes it up nicely in one sentence. He says, many evangelicals object to actions to slow climate change, but they don't do so on a religious basis. They do so politically because they believe the government wants to take away their freedom. So the important thing we need to do is we need to connect this issue with the values we already have. And one of the core values we have is caring for those less fortunate than us. So this is a map of the percentage of people who live in poverty in all these different countries. Try not to blink here because I'm going to show you a second map, okay? Focus on this map and where the dark places are, and then look at this map and where the dark places are. Who's most vulnerable to a changing climate? The people who live in the poorest parts of the world. There is a direct connection between poverty, hunger, disease, and a changing climate. And for us Christians, recognizing that hunger is exacerbated by climate change, that lack of access to water is exacerbated by climate change, that diseases that nobody should be dying from in 2018 are exacerbated by a changing climate, that's a direct connection to our hearts, to our values, to why we care. So the best picture I have of a changing climate, I see a few questions coming in there. That's great. Keep them coming. We're getting to them in 1 minute. The best analogy I have for a changing climate is a bucket. And the bucket is something that we care about. We care about alleviating poverty, about disease, about helping women and children in developing countries. We care about these issues, and we're pouring all of our time and our money and our prayers and our effort into this bucket. But the bucket has a hole, and the hole is climate change, and the hole is getting bigger and bigger. The reason we care about a changing climate is because it affects all of the things that we already care about that are already at the top of our priority list today. So why do we Christians care? It isn't just because climate change affects us, even though it is. We care about it because it affects real people today, especially the poorest and most vulnerable among us. I was speaking at a benefit for a woman's homeless shelter in Halifax a couple of weeks ago. And a lot of people there, you could kind of tell, they're like, why do they have a climate scientist speaking at a benefit for a homeless shelter? But when I started to explain all this stuff, you could see the light bulbs going off, because when you have massive heavy rain events like they're having there, when you have incredible record-setting heat waves like they're having there, and yes, you can have heat waves in Canada, and if we're not ready for them, they can be devastating. In this past summer, they did kill dozens of people across the country. Who suffers first? Homeless people. So there's a direct connection between all of these things in a changing climate, and that is why we care. So the bottom line is this: we Christians, if we truly take what the Bible says seriously, we should be at the front of the line demanding action on climate change, because we are called to walk in love as we have already been loved. And today, caring about a changing climate is an expression of that love. Or as they say in Texas, where they publish the Bible on road signs, that love thy neighbor thing, I really meant it. Signed, God. So what I want to close with is I want to close with something that's a bit unusual for a climate science presentation. But again, if the biggest problem we have is that we don't think it matters to us, then the solution to it is to connect the dots. between us, between why we care about a changing climate. And the solution to that is to talk about why we care, not so much from the head, although all the facts and the data are very important, but to talk about it from the heart, to connect the issue directly between our values and a changing climate. So why do we care? We care about it because God has given us responsibility for the well-being of every living thing on this planet, Genesis 1. We care about it because it's taking the risks that we face right here, our neighbors, our friends, our family, our communities, and it's exacerbating them or making them worse. And it's affecting real people today, especially the poorest and most vulnerable in this world. This is why we care, and this is why the most important thing that we can do about a changing climate is talk about it. So I'm going to leave you with this because my TED Talk just came out on Friday, and it's all about how do you talk about climate change. So if you're interested in going a little bit further than what we have in this webinar, check out the TED Talk. You can just Google my name, it's online, and it gets all into how do we connect the dots between what's in our heart and this overwhelming concern of a changing climate. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Katharine. We very much appreciate you being on here today, and it was just a great job. We have about 5 minutes left, so we're going to take a couple questions and go for that. And I'm going to screen some of these since we have a question of it together. You know, one of the questions that I answer a lot too, and I can answer this separately, but how do you talk to Christians who, be interesting to see your answer to this, is the people who talk about the end of the world's coming. I mean, your husband has that theology, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. So what are we supposed to do with the, if the world's going to burn up anyhow, why should we care?
Exactly. So what I'm going to do, since our time is short, is I'm actually going to point everybody to a resource that I think is really important, and that is our Global Weirding series. And so I'm going to share my screen with you again so you can actually see it. Let's see, where are we going here? We're going to here. There we go. All right, so this is our Global Weirding series, and what's absolutely fascinating, we have a series of videos on every different part of the US, but what fascinates me is, you know what, which video has the most views of any video? The Bible doesn't talk about climate change, does it? That is the one that everybody wants to watch. So I will give you a 30-second version, but I would ask everybody to please go and watch that video and then watch the very next one, which is if I just explain the facts, because those two videos answer, I think, just every question I saw in the chat window, actually. Those two videos answer just about every question I see here in the chat window on how do we have conversations with our friends, with our brothers and sisters, with those who believe very similar or the same theology that we do. How do we address their issues? And the bottom line is this: not by arguing over the science. Even if Sarah Huckabee Sanders says it's not based on facts, the answer to that is simply, yes, it is, but then transition. Transition immediately to connecting the dots between something we care about. So it's not based on facts, but yes, it is. And did you know there's more jobs in the solar energy industry now than in the entire fossil fuel industry in the power sector in the US? That's an incredible solutions-based factoid that people can't have a problem with, because people have a problem with what they perceive to be the solutions. And by offering positive, constructive solutions, that's how we're going to get past this. Now, Darren mentioned the really cool technology that sucks carbon out of the atmosphere, and that is already being tested today, but it is super expensive, and it is not going to fix this for us. It's like, you know, like saying, you know, the #1 solution to obesity is removing everybody's stomach. That is a very expensive and intrusive way to fix the problem of our diet. So it is one contribution to the solution, but if you go to Project Drawdown, one of my favorite resources, it lists 80 different solutions to climate change, and some of them are going to absolutely surprise you. #3 is reducing food waste. #6 is education of women and girls in developing countries. So when you talk to people, educate yourself on really cool, inspirational solutions, and Project Drawdown is a great place to start, as is my Facebook feed, and shift the conversation there. If they throw up religiously sounding smoke screens, you can address them from the Bible. Like one religiously sounding smoke screen, of course, is, you know, the world's going to end anyway, so why do we care? Well, of course, humans are humans. We never change. Back in Thessalonians, people were saying, oh, well, you know, Christ is going to return tomorrow, so I'm just going to quit my job and lay back, sit in the easy chair, fold my hands. And the Apostle Paul wrote to them, he said, no. He said, get a job, support your family, care for the widows and the orphans. You don't know when Christ is returning, and we are called to walk in love. It is not walking in love to complacently fold your hands and say the end is coming. We are to care for our brothers and sisters today. So there's biblical, sound theological answers to people, even if people say, it's all going to end anyways, or God is in control. The God is in control one is really funny because that's addressed right in Genesis 1. It says God gave us responsibility over every living thing on this planet, which I point out includes humans. We are also living things. So we are responsible for our brothers and sisters as well. God gave that to us. And in Revelation, of course, there's that very darkly funny verse that says, God will destroy those who destroy the earth. I say it's dark humor because, if somebody thinks that we can't destroy the earth, well, just go to Revelation. God actually tells us that is a possibility. So talking solutions and directly attaching this to the values we already have is the key. And I would encourage you to watch my TED Talk and watch the first 2 episodes of Global Weirding. And then last night I spoke at Grace Capital City Church in Washington, D.C., and they recorded that and they're going to put it online as part of their podcast. So if you listen to podcasts, look for Grace Capital City Church, and that podcast is going to give you an example of how I personally connect the dots for people who share our faith but might not be on board, because I would guess probably about 1/3 of the people at that church were not on board with the idea that climate is changing due to human activities and it's possible to fix it. So those are 4 different resources that really, I think, actually address every question we have here.
Oh, Katharine, thank you so much. I'm going to leave us with, besides saying thank you to you, a little bit of a hopeful note. Is the EEN staff has probably called on close to 100 either Senate or congressional offices of all Republicans since July. And we now have probably 70 offices that want to meet together and talk about solutions to climate change. And I think that's the hopeful message that's happening, because people are seeing it, they're living it. It's hard for a defense person to say climate change really isn't happening when right next door they announced just this week or last week actually that the Naval Academy is building a seawall because they currently have 36 days of sunny day flooding. And so things are happening, things are moving, but I think we have to work together to empower the church. And I guess lastly, I would say your message is very similar to ours, and we're glad of that because you've taught me a lot of it, is the fact that we have to speak people in the values that they hold dearest to themselves. To change people and to get people to come on board with finding solutions and tackling this problem really requires helping them to move their heart. And the only way people move their heart is by using those things that are of value to them, of dear to them, and that helps them to change. And so with that, I again want to thank you very, very much. It is a pleasure. Hey, we haven't had a cup of coffee for a long time, so we need to do that and catch up. So thank you so much. And everybody who joined us today, this has been recorded. And Katharine, I hope we have your permission to keep showing this, if that's okay. And so we will do that. And thank you so much for joining us. Have a blessed day. Have a blessed Christmas. And may next year be the year we really get into some action to find solution to climate change. Amen. Thank you very much. Thank you all.